The man I couldn't love. The proposal I had to refuse, a story of family, desire, and heartbreak. Chapter 1, The Golden Cage. They called our house the Carter Manor, though in Greenwich, Connecticut, everyone knew it by a different name, the Golden Cage. Not because it was unattractive, quite the opposite. The house on Round Hill Road was a colonial masterpiece, white-columned and immaculate, surrounded by manicured lawns that stretched toward the Long Island Sound like they were trying to escape. But cages, I had come to learn, are most beautiful when you're trapped inside them. I was Eleanor Marie Carter, Ellie to the few people in this world allowed to call me that, and I was 22 years old the autumn I met Daniel Ashford. My father, Harrison Carter, was a private equity legend in Manhattan, the kind of man whose name opened doors on Park Avenue before he even reached for the handle. My mother, Diana, had been a Vogue cover model in her day and now dedicated her life to the Greenwich Auxiliary Board, which meant she spent most of her time organizing charity galas and judging the table settings at other people's dinners. I loved them both, in the complicated way you love the people who have shaped every contour of your existence without ever asking if you wanted to be shaped. They had given me everything, the best school, the finest horses, a trust fund that would make most people weep with envy. What they had not given me was a single moment of genuine choice. My father controlled every detail of my life with the precision of a man who managed billion-dollar portfolios. What I wore to dinner. Which friends were acceptable. What I studied at Yale art history, because Harrison Carter had decided that a Carter daughter did not need a practical career but should have enough education to discuss culture intelligently at cocktail parties. Whether I could take a gap year to travel. Whether I could date. Especially whether I could date. Ellie, my father would say, his voice low and measured, delivered with the calm authority of a man who had never been contradicted in his life, you are not ready to give your heart to anyone. You don't know the world. You don't know yourself. And until you do, you will date only the young men I select, and you will do so with the understanding that any serious courtship leads to an introduction to suitable families. Suitable families. As if I were a pony being shown at a horse auction, evaluated for breeding potential and coat sheen. That autumn, I was working part-time at my mother's insistence, not because we needed money, but because, as my father put it, people who have never worked have no appreciation for the value of a dollar. I volunteered twice a week at the Greenwich Community Children's Center, a modest non-profit preschool on the outskirts of town, far from the gilded zip code of Round Hill Road. It was the one place in my life where no one knew my last name, where I was simply Ellie, the young woman who helped with arts and crafts and read picture books in a voice that made 4-year-olds fall quiet and listen. I loved those children with a ferocity that startled me. In a world of silk wallpaper and engraved invitations, they were gloriously, messily real. They spilled juice. They fought over crayons. They hugged my legs without asking permission. They had no idea that the Carter family name carried any weight, and in that blissful ignorance, I found the only freedom I had ever known. That's where I was on a gray Saturday afternoon in October when Daniel walked in. He wasn't supposed to be there. He was subbing for his sister's regular shift. His sister was one of the lead teachers, a woman named Sophie who had broken her ankle running the Greenwich Half Marathon. Daniel showed up in a faded Yale sweatshirt and jeans, holding a canvas tote bag stuffed with construction paper and a thermos of coffee, looking completely disoriented. I think I'm in the wrong place, he said, staring at the brightly colored walls. I'm supposed to be at a construction site, is this a daycare? It's a preschool, I said, and I remember that my very first thought, was that he had the most extraordinary eyes. Not blue, not brown, but something in between, the color of strong coffee held up to the light. They were warm and wry and entirely unguarded, and they met mine without the faintest flicker of the calculation I'd grown so accustomed to seeing in men's gazes. He wasn't looking at me and calculating my net worth. He wasn't assessing whether I was a suitable match. He was simply looking at me as a person, standing in front of him, in a room that smelled like finger paint and apple slices. You're not in the wrong place, I said. You're exactly where Sophie needs you. She's the one who broke her ankle. He groaned. That woman is going to get herself killed one of these days. All right. What do I do? And that was how it began. Daniel Ashford, 29 years old, a structural engineer who designed bridges and parking garages and things that were supposed to stand for 100 years, spending his Saturday afternoon learning how to help a room full of 4-year-olds make jack-o'-lanterns out of paper bags. He was terrible at it. Wonderfully, charmingly terrible. He cut the triangles for the pumpkins' eyes crooked, so they looked like the pumpkins were cross-eyed. He got orange paint on his sweatshirt, then green paint in his hair, then somehow managed to get a stripe of purple across his cheekbone that made the children shriek with laughter. He laughed with them, not at himself, not performing humility, just genuinely delighted, as though the whole messy disaster was the best thing that had happened to him all week. Never again, he said to me, watching Tyler Morrison a perfectly good art project by gluing googly eyes all over his paper bag. I am never letting Sophie talk me into anything ever again. But the following Saturday, he was back. And the Saturday after that. Chapter 2, The Forbidden Garden. By November, we had established a rhythm. We would see each other every Saturday at the children's center, and then, after the children left and the room was quiet and the janitor was sweeping up the detritus of 1,000 tiny handprints, we would walk together to the cafe on Greenwich Avenue, the Roasted Bean, a modest place that would have scandalized my parents if they had ever learned of my patronage there. My father did not approve of public coffee shops. He had a private barista. We talked for hours. About everything. About nothing. About the way the late autumn light fell through the cafe windows and turned everything amber. About his work, which fascinated me, the mathematics of weight distribution, the poetry of load-bearing structures, the way a bridge could be both a feat of engineering and a work of art. He showed me photographs on his phone of bridges he had designed across New England, and I was unexpectedly moved by them, by the idea that he built things that were meant to outlast him. "You're different," he said one afternoon, setting down his coffee cup and studying me with those extraordinary eyes. "I can't figure out what your story is, Ellie. You show up every week in clothes that probably cost more than my car payment. You drive a car that still has that new car smell. And yet you're here, covered in paint, happy as a clam, making turkeys out of paper plates with kids who think you're the greatest thing since sliced bread." I felt the familiar cold clutch of fear in my chest. For the first time in my life, I wanted to tell someone the truth. I wanted to tell him about the house on Round Hill Road, about my father's controlled smile and my mother's careful silence, about the gilded prison I had inhabited for 22 years. But the words wouldn't come. Because I knew, I had always known, that telling him would change everything. "Maybe I'm just someone who likes turkeys," I said lightly. He didn't push. He just smiled, a slow, warm smile that reached his eyes and made them glow, and said, "Okay. Keep your secrets. I've got plenty of my own." And he told me about his. His mother had died when he was 17, a long and brutal illness that had drained the family savings and left his father a broken man. Daniel had worked his way through college and graduate school, paying off loans and supporting his father and still managing to graduate with honors. He was $30,000 away from paying off the last of his student loans. He had never taken a cent from anyone, and he never would. "The thing about building things with your own hands," he said, "is that they're actually yours. No one can take them away from you. No one can tell you you didn't earn them." I sat across from this man, this beautiful, stubborn, self-made man, and self the first crack form in the wall I had built around my heart. He was everything my father would despise. He had no family connections, no old money, no inherited legacy. He was a bridge builder from the middle of nowhere, New Hampshire, and he had worked for everything he had. My father would have taken one look at his worn sneakers and his unpretentious charm and decided he wasn't good enough to shine my shoes. And that, right there, was the moment I should have walked away. The moment I should have recognized that Daniel Ashford and I existed in different universes, separated by an uncrossable divide of class and expectation and the terrible power of the Carter name. But I didn't walk away. I couldn't. I had spent my entire life being told who to be, what to wear, how to think, and here was this man who had built himself from nothing, who owed no one anything, who looked at me like I was a mystery he genuinely wanted to solve rather than a props to be won and displayed. We began to see each other outside the children's center. We met for dinner at a small Italian restaurant in Cathcob, far from the Greenwich dining establishments my parents frequented. We walked through the autumn woods behind the church on Sunday mornings. We talked until 2 in the morning, sprawled on the floor of his apartment, a modest one-bedroom in Stamford that had exposed brick and a view of a parking lot and was the most honest space I had ever been in, while a jazz station played softly on his vintage radio. I started lying to my parents. Small lies at first. I'm staying late at the center to help with the newsletter. Sophie invited me for coffee. I'll be back by 6. The lies came easier than I expected, probably because they were the first genuine choices I had ever made. Every lie was a tiny act of rebellion, a small declaration that I existed as a person separate from the Carter family brand. My mother noticed first. She had a radar for deviation, the way sharks have a sixth sense for blood in the water. She noticed the new expression I wore, a secret smile that flickered across my face at odd moments, as though I were remembering something luscious. She noticed that I had started wearing my hair differently, pulled back in a loose knot instead of the immaculate blowout she had taught me to perfect. She noticed that I hummed when I got dressed in the morning. "Ellie," she said one evening, as I came down the grand staircase in a cashmere sweater I had chosen myself, a deep burgundy, not the navy or cream my father preferred. "We need to talk about the Whitmore dinner next week. Your father has arranged for you to meet the Harrington boy, Edward. He's very well connected." "I know who Edward Harrington is," I said, and my voice came out colder than I intended. Edward Harrington was 26, Harvard Law, a junior partner at his father's firm, and the kind of young man who had never in his life made a decision that hadn't been pre-approved by a committee of advisors. He was perfectly nice and utterly, catastrophically boring. "He's an exceptional young man," my mother said, with the careful neutrality meant she was choosing her words the way a surgeon chooses a scalpel. "Your father has high hopes." "I'm sure he does." "Ellie." She stood, and in the lamplight of the foyer, I saw something flicker in her expression, not anger, but something more complicated. Something that might have been recognition. "Your father loves you. Everything he does is to ensure your future. You know that." I looked at my mother, this beautiful, polished woman who had given up her modeling career to become a Carter, who had traded her own ambitions for a seat at the most exclusive table in Connecticut, and I saw my future in her face. I saw the slow suffocation of a life lived according to someone else's blueprint. I saw the woman I would become if I didn't find the courage to choose differently. "I know, Mom," I said. And I went to my room and called Daniel, and his voice, warm, real, awake, made the walls of the golden cage feel a little less permanent. Chapter 3: The Reckoning. The collision, when it came, was not subtle. Nothing about my life was ever subtle again after that night. It was December, the first week of December, when Greenwich transformed itself into a Christmas card, all twinkling lights and fresh pine swags and the faint smell of wood smoke from estate fireplaces. I had been seeing Daniel for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of stolen hours and secret dinners and his hands in my hair and the terrifying, exhilarating sensation of falling in love with someone who had no idea who I really was. I told him. I finally told him. We were in his apartment, wrapped in a blanket on his second-hand sofa, watching the snow fall outside the window over the parking lot. The radio was playing something melancholic and beautiful, Coltrane, maybe, or Miles Davis. I was never good at telling the difference. His arm was around me, and I was curled against his chest, and I felt the kind of peace I had never known existed in this world. "My name isn't just Ellie," I said. It's Eleanor Marie Carter. I felt his body go still beneath me, the way a structure goes still when the load calculations are suddenly, catastrophically wrong. Carter, he repeated slowly. As in Harrison Carter? The private equity Harrison Carter? As in Round Hill Road, the Carter Foundation, the Carter Gallery of Art, and every other gilded thing my father has purchased over the last 40 years. I sat up and looked at him, and I watched his expression shift through a cascade of emotions, disbelief, recognition, recalibration, and I saw the exact moment the walls went up. I said at Tothia's ear, Jesus Christ, Ellie. Ellie's real, I said. That's what my mother calls me. That's what you call me. Eleanor is the name on the trust fund and the guest list and the Yale diploma that I didn't earn, that my father purchased with a building. He stood up and walked to the window, and he stood there for a long time, looking out at the snow, his back to me, his shoulders rigid. I watched him, and I felt like I was watching a bridge begin to crack, the first fissure spreading slowly through the concrete, imperceptible but catastrophic. Why didn't you tell me? His voice was quiet. Not angry. Just quiet. The quietest I had ever heard it. Because I knew this would happen. Because the minute you found out, I'd become a Carter, and you'd start calculating whether you were good enough, and everything we've built would turn into something ugly. He turned around. His eyes were blazing. You think I care about your money? I think you care about your pride. Christ. He ran his hands through his hair. You think I'm some kind of, what, a gold digger? Is that what you think of me? Of course not. But I think you have pride, Daniel. Real, legitimate pride. And I think when you walk into a room with me on your arm, people are going to look at you and wonder what I see in you. And I think that will eat at you. Because you're not used to being underestimated. He stared at me for a long moment, and then he crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled me to my feet and kissed me, hard, desperate, like he was trying to pour every ounce of his frustration and desire and terror into the contact of our mouths. And I kissed him back, because I couldn't help it, because despite everything, despite the chasm that had just yawned open between us, I wanted him with a force that felt geological, tectonic, like the slow and inexorable grinding of continents. We'll figure it out, he murmured against my lips. We'll figure it out, Ellie. I don't care about your father. I don't care about his money or his name or his goddamn Manhattan office. I care about you. We can't just. We can. He pulled back and looked at me, and his eyes were fierce, certain, absolute. I love you. Do you hear me? I love you. And I'm not letting you go because your father has opinions about bridge builders. I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to believe him so badly that I felt it in my marrow, in my blood, in the spaces between my heartbeats. But I had lived my entire life in the shadow of Harrison Carter, and I knew with the certainty of someone who had watched this man operate for 22 years, that my father would not simply capitulate. He would not be reasoned with. He would not be moved by the authenticity of Daniel's love or the depth of my feeling. My father was a fortress, and fortresses are built to hold. That was Thursday. By Saturday, my father knew. I still don't know how he found out. My mother says it was the private investigator he hired after noticing my behavioral changes, a man named Garrett who had been tracking my movements for weeks, photographing my trips to Costco, the Italian restaurant, Daniel's apartment building. My father had files on Daniel by Tuesday morning, his credit report, his employment history, his salary, his student loan balance, his arrest record, clean, his driving record, 2 speeding tickets, and a full financial net worth assessment that concluded, in its cold numerical language, that Daniel Ashford was not a suitable match for an Eleanor Carter. My father did not call me into his study to discuss it. He did not summon me with a raised voice. Harrison Carter did not raise his voice. He sat in his leather chair behind the mahogany desk, under the portrait of his grandfather that dominated the wall, and he waited. He waited until I came downstairs for dinner, dressed in my usual cashmere, my heart already pounding with dread. He waited until my mother had poured the first course of soup and retreated to the kitchen. And then, with the calm of a man discussing a market correction, he said, "Ellie, I understand you've been involved with a young man outside your social circle. This must stop. Not I've heard reports. Not we need to talk about your behavior. Just, this must stop." I set down my spoon. My hand was trembling, but I made myself meet his eyes. His name is Daniel. He's an engineer. He's kind and brilliant, and he makes me happier than I've ever been. He's a nobody. He's a man who built his own life from nothing. He's a 29-year-old man with $60,000 in the bank, a second-hand car, and a job that involves pouring concrete. My father's voice remained level, almost gentle, which was somehow worse than shouting. "Ellie, I have spent your entire life preparing you for a world that functions according to certain standards. Not because I'm cruel, but because I love you. Because I know what you are capable of, and that is far more than a life with this man. You're not giving him a chance. You haven't even met him. I don't need to meet him. I know everything about him that matters." My father folded his hands on the desk. He grew up in a farmhouse in New Hampshire. His father is a retired postal worker. Daniel has a master's degree from a state university and a job at a mid-sized engineering firm. His annual income is less than what we pay the groundskeeper, Eleanor. His income doesn't define him. "No," my father said, and now his voice carried the first edge of steel. "But your choice of a marriage partner defines this family. It defines the Carter legacy. And I will not allow you to throw it away for a man who designs parking structures." The contempt in his voice was surgical. I watched it land, parking structures, and I saw the way his lip curled with the faintest suggestion of disdain. And I realized, with a clarity that felt like ice water in my veins, that my father would never see Daniel the way I saw him. That the divide between their worlds was not something that love could bridge, because my father was not interested in crossing it. He had built his walls too high and too thick, and he had no intention of lowering them for anyone. "I love him, Dad." "You think you do? You're 22 years old. You don't know what love is. Then let me learn." My father looked at me for a long, long moment. And then he did something he had never done before. He stood up, walked around the desk, and sat down on the edge of it, closer to me than he had ever voluntarily positioned himself. He took my hands in his hands so familiar, the hands that had held mine at recitals and graduations and countless other performances of filial devotion, and he said, "Ellie, listen to me. I need you to understand something. This is not a negotiation. This is not a discussion. You will end this relationship, and you will do it tonight. If you do not, I will freeze your trust fund, I will cancel your car insurance, and I will have you removed from the Children's Center volunteer program. And I will make sure that Daniel Ashford never works in this industry again. I have the connections. I have the resources. And I have absolutely no hesitation about using them." He squeezed my hands. Gently, almost lovingly. "I am telling you this because I love you. Because I want better for you than a man who will still be struggling to pay off his mortgage when you're 40. Because the world is hard, Eleanor, and the people in it will eat you alive if you don't have the protection of a family behind you. Daniel Ashford cannot protect you. He can barely protect himself." He released my hands and returned to his chair. "The Whitmore dinner is on the 15th. You will attend, and you will be civil to Edward Harrington. This is not negotiable." I sat in that chair, my father's chair, the chair I had sat in for every important conversation of my life, and I felt the last of my resistance crumble. Not because I believed his threats, though I did, but because I looked at the portrait of my grandfather on the wall, at the long line of Carters stretching back through generations, and I understood, with a terrible and final clarity, that I was not my own person. I was a link in a chain, and chains are only as strong as their weakest link, and I was not strong enough to break free. Okay, I said, and the word tasted like ash in my mouth. Chapter 4: The Proposal. I broke up with Daniel in his apartment on a Tuesday night. I drove there in my BMW, the car my father had given me for my 21st birthday, pearl white, smelling of new leather and someone else's idea of freedom, and I sat in the driveway for 20 minutes, watching his window, trying to find the courage to go inside and destroy the only beautiful thing I had ever had. When I finally walked in, he knew. He took one look at my face and he knew, and the expression that crossed his features was something I will carry with me for the rest of my life, a mixture of hope and dread, as though he were standing on the edge of a cliff and hoping someone would tell him the ground was still solid beneath his feet. Ellie. He said my name like a prayer, like a question. I'm sorry, I said, and then I was crying, and I couldn't stop, and he held me on that second-hand sofa with the exposed springs while I sobbed into his sweatshirt, and I told him everything. The investigator, the threats, the frozen trust fund, the Whitmore dinner, Edward Harrington and his Harvard law degree and his pre-approved future. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I can fight him. You can't. I can try. I can. Daniel. I pulled back and looked at him, and I memorized his face, every line, every shadow, every trace of the man I was leaving behind. You're an engineer. You calculate load-bearing capacity. You know when something is structurally unsound and needs to be torn down and rebuilt. This, I gestured between us, between our two worlds, this is not something you can engineer your way out of. My father is not a problem. He is a force of nature. And you can't fight a force of nature. You can only survive it. Then come with me, he said, and his voice cracked on the words, and I saw tears in his eyes for the first time. This man who had never cried, who had held his mother's hand through her final months without flinching, who had worked 18-hour days for years to pay off his loans. Come with me. We can leave. We can go somewhere he can't reach us. New Hampshire, California, anywhere. I don't care about the money, Ellie. I have enough. We'll figure it out. And God help me, I almost said yes. I almost took his hand and ran. I imagined it, a small house, a different life, waking up next to him every morning without the shadow of Harrison Carter falling across our bed. It was the most beautiful dream I had ever had. But I couldn't. I couldn't because I looked at my father's face in my mind, the quiet devastation he would feel, the betrayal that would break something fundamental in our relationship, and I realized that I still loved him. That despite everything, despite the cage and the controls and the iron grip, I loved my father, and I couldn't bear to be the thing that destroyed him. Take some time, I said. Please. Just give me some time. Maybe things will change. Maybe I can find a way. But things did not change. My father held firm. Daniel called me every day for 2 weeks, leaving voice messages that I deleted without listening to because I couldn't bear to hear his voice and still choose the cage. My mother watched me with a worried expression that she carefully hid whenever my father was in the room. The Whitmore dinner came and went, and I sat across from Edward Harrington and made all the right noises and felt nothing, nothing but the vast, aching emptiness where Daniel used to be. And then, in February, something extraordinary happened. I was at the Children's Center. My father had not, in the end, removed me from the volunteer program, perhaps because he sensed that it was the one concession he could afford to make without losing face. It was a cold, bright Saturday, and I was sitting on the floor of the reading nook with a group of 5-year-olds, reading them a picture book about the lost penguin, when the door opened and Daniel walked in. He was not supposed to be there. Sophie had recovered months ago. But there he was, standing in the doorway in a gray wool coat, holding a small velvet box in one hand, looking at me with an expression that was equal parts terror and determination. "Could I borrow Eleanor for a moment?" he said to Sophie. It's important. Sophie's eyebrow shot up, but she nodded. I stood up slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs, and followed him into the hallway. The children buzzed with excitement. In their experience, dramatic interruptions to story time were the very height of entertainment. Daniel led me to the small coat room at the end of the hall, between the cubbies with the children's jackets and the stack of spare diapers. It was cramped and dim and smelled like wool and cleaning solution. It was the least romantic space imaginable. And it was perfect, because it was ours. It was the kind of place where two people might actually be real. Ellie. He was trembling. I had never seen him tremble before. I know what your father said. I know about the money and the threats and all of it. I know you think this is impossible. Daniel, please don't. Let me finish. He took a breath. I have spent the last 3 months trying to figure out how to compete with a man who can destroy me with a phone call. And I realized something. I can't compete with him. I don't have his connections or his money or his power. But I have something he doesn't have. What? You. He opened the velvet box. Inside was a ring, not a diamond, not an engagement killer of a gemstone, but a simple band of brushed titanium with a thin vein of gold running through it, like a thread of sunlight through dark stone. I designed it myself. It's a load-bearing ring. See this? He pointed to the gold vein. This is the stress line. The point where the structure carries the most weight. It's the strongest part of the ring, because the point of greatest stress is also the point of greatest strength. I stared at the ring. I stared at him. I felt the tears coming again, hot and unstoppable. I don't have a house on Round Hill Road, Daniel continued, his voice steady now, certain. I don't have a trust fund or a private equity firm or a legacy to protect. But I have a career I love, a roof over my head that I paid for myself, and a heart that belongs entirely to you. And I am asking you, Eleanor Marie Carter, girl from the Golden Cage, to marry me. Not because I can give you what your father can give you, but because I can give you something he never could. What's that? A choice. He met my eyes. I'm asking you to choose. Not for the family. Not for the legacy. Not for the money or the name or the Connecticut zip code. For yourself. For the life you actually want to live. I stood in that cramped coat room, surrounded by children's snow boots and spare mittens, and I felt the full weight of the decision pressing down on me like a collapsing structure. I thought of my father, alone in his study, learning that his daughter had chosen a bridge builder over a legacy. I thought of my mother, standing in the foyer, watching her own life story repeat in her daughter's choices. I thought of Edward Harrington and the Whitmore dinner and the endless parade of suitable young men my father had lined up for my inspection. And then I thought of Daniel. Of his hands building things. Of his voice reading bedtime stories to 4-year-olds who thought he was wonderful. Of the way he looked at me like I was a mystery worth solving, not a prize worth owning. Of the life we could have, of modest and honest and real, built with our own hands, unencumbered by legacy and expectation. I choose you, I whispered. God help us, Bo, I choose you. His face broke into the most radiant smile I had ever seen. He kissed me, there in the coat room, among the mittens and the snow boots and the smell of wool, and I felt the golden cage door swing open for the first time in my life. But even as I said yes, even as he slipped the ring onto my finger and held my face in his hands, I knew that the hardest part was not the choosing. The hardest part was what came next. Because choosing Daniel meant losing my family, and I was not ready, I was not strong enough to pay that price. Not yet. Not then. We had 2 weeks. 2 weeks of secret happiness, of stolen dinners and whispered plans, of a future sketched out on napkins and cocktail napkins at the Roasted Bean. We looked at apartments in Stamford. We talked about the future, about maybe starting our own engineering firm, about the children we might have, about a small wedding in New Hampshire with nothing but pine trees and honesty. And then my father found out. Not from an investigator this time. From my mother, who had noticed the ring on my finger when I reached for my glass of water at dinner, and who had gone pale and left the table and told him immediately. My father did not come to find me. He did not call. He simply left a note on my bedside table, written in his precise, architectural handwriting. We need to talk. Tomorrow morning. Don't make me come looking for you. I didn't sleep that night. Daniel drove me to Greenwich at 7 the next morning, and he waited in the car at the end of the driveway while I walked up the long gravel path toward the house that had been my home for 22 years. My father was waiting for me in the study. He was standing by the window, looking out at the grounds, his back to the door. He didn't turn when I came in. He didn't speak. He just stood there, a tall, immaculate figure in a charcoal suit, silhouetted against the February morning light. I waited. 5 seconds. 10. 20. Finally, he turned. His face was not angry. It was something worse. It was disappointed. Not in my behavior, in me. As though I had confirmed something he had always suspected about the weakness of my character. Is it true? He asked. Yes. He nodded slowly, as though checking a box on an internal ledger. Then he picked up a manila folder from his desk and handed it to me.
Daniel Ashford's employment file, he said, including the names and direct lines of every client of his firm. I have made some calls. By Monday, Daniel will be let go. Not for cause. Simply because the clients will no longer renew their contracts. My blood went cold. You can't do that. I already have. He sat down in his chair and steepled his fingers. And this is just the beginning, Eleanor.
I told you what would happen. I told you I would use my resources. I meant it. You can have him. You can choose him. But the world he lives in will become very uncomfortable very quickly. You're blackmailing me. I'm protecting my daughter from a catastrophic mistake. It's not a mistake. I love him. You think you love him. He leaned forward. You are 22 years old, Eleanor. You have known this man for 3 months. You are infatuated. That is not love. Love is stable. Love is secure. Love does not require you to sacrifice your entire future and the legacy of this family. And what about my future? What about what I want? What you want is a fantasy. A romantic delusion fed by hormones and a man who knows exactly how to exploit a lonely, privileged girl who has never been told no. The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt them land, lonely, privileged girl, and I watched my father's face as he said them, and I saw no regret, no hesitation, no softening. He meant every syllable. Here is what will happen, my father continued. You will end this relationship. You will do it today. You will go back to school. I've arranged for you to take them cats in the spring, and then you'll apply to Columbia Medical School. You will become a doctor, or you will do something equally respectable and ambitious. And in the meantime, you will begin a courtship with a young man named William Whitfield, whom I have personally selected, and who comes from a family I have known for 30 years. And if I refuse? My father smiled. It was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. Then Daniel Ashford will not only lose his job. He will lose his ability to work in this industry. Permanently. I will ensure that every firm within 500 miles knows his name and the reason they should never hire him. I will make it my personal mission to dismantle everything he has built. And when he's flipping burgers because no one will hire a structural engineer who made enemies of the Carter family, ask yourself, was your love worth destroying his life? I stood in my father's study, the manila folder in my hands, and I understood, with perfect and horrible clarity, that he was not bluffing. Harrison Carter did not bluff. He calculated. He strategized. And he always won. I looked at the ring on my finger, Daniel's ring, the titanium band with its vein of gold, the stress line that was supposed to be the strongest part. I thought about what my father was offering: security, comfort, legacy, the continuation of a story that stretched back generations. And I thought about what Daniel was offering: love, freedom, a life of genuine choice that I would have to build with my own hands in the shadow of my father's displeasure. I thought about the children at the center, and the way Daniel had looked holding a 4-year-old's hand for the first time, so careful, so gentle, as though the child were something precious and breakable. I thought about the ring I was wearing, designed to bear weight, to hold firm under pressure. I thought about the kind of woman I wanted to be. And then I thought about my father, alone in this house, when his only daughter walked away. I thought about the Carter legacy, which was not just money and property and social standing, but also the people who had carried it, people I loved, despite everything. I thought about my mother, who had given up her own dreams to become a Carter, and who had never once complained, and who looked at me sometimes with an expression I could not read. I couldn't do it. I couldn't be the one to break this family. I couldn't be the link in the chain that broke. I need to think, I said. You have until tonight, my father replied. After dinner. Come to me with your decision. I walked out of the study. I walked down the long hallway with its inherited artwork and its Persian carpets. I walked out the front door and down the gravel path to where Daniel was waiting in the car, his face full of hope and terror and love. I got in the passenger seat. I looked at him. I took off the ring and placed it in his palm and closed his fingers around it. I can't, I said. And the sound that came out of him was not a word. It was a sound I have never been able to replicate or forget, something between a laugh and a sob, the sound of a structure collapsing under a load it was never designed to bear. Chapter 5: The Aftermath. The weeks that followed were the darkest of my life. Daniel called me 17 times on the first day. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I sat in my room with my phone on silent, listening to it vibrate against my nightstand, each vibration a small act of violence against everything I wanted. He called from different numbers after that: Sophie's phone, a coworker's phone, once from a number I didn't recognize that I later learned was a payphone on the post road. He showed up at the children's center, and I hid in the supply closet until Sophie texted me that he was gone. He drove to Round Hill Road and sat in his car at the end of the driveway for hours, and my father had the security gate locked and the private security firm installed, and still Daniel came. For 3 weeks, he came. And then he stopped. I found out later, from Sophie, that he had taken a job offer in Portland, Maine, a small engineering firm that specialized in historic bridge restoration. He had left Greenwich, left Connecticut, left everything we had built together, and he had started over. Again. Alone. The way he had always done things. I enrolled in the MCAT prep course my father selected. I attended the Columbia Medical School information session. I met William Whitfield for brunch at the Garden City Hotel, and I made polite conversation and laughed at his jokes and felt nothing but the hollow space where Daniel used to be. William was tall and handsome and well-mannered and utterly, catastrophically boring, and when he talked about his plans to join his father's law firm and run for state senate by 40, I wanted to scream. But I didn't scream. I smiled. I nodded. I let my father introduce me to the Whitfield family at a charity polo match in Palm Beach, where I wore a cream linen dress and expression of pleasant vacancy and felt like I was watching my own life from a great distance, through a thick pane of glass. By April, my father announced that William and I were officially courting. By June, the engagement was announced in the Greenwich time. By August, the wedding date was set for October, a grand affair at St. Church on the Green, with a guest list of 400 that read like a who's who of Connecticut's old guard. I said yes to the dress. I said yes to the flowers. I said yes to the caterer and the band and the engagement party and the bridal shower and all the 1,000 small decisions that went into the construction of a wedding that was less about love than about the merger of 2 family brands. And then, 2 weeks before the wedding, William Whitfield proposed a prenuptial agreement. Not an unusual thing in our world. Quite the norm. But the terms William's lawyer had drafted were unusually aggressive. They essentially stripped me of any claim to the Whitfield family assets while guaranteeing William a generous monthly allowance and full ownership of the marital home in the event of divorce. My father reviewed the document and pronounced it reasonable. My mother said nothing. And I sat in my father's study and read the clause that stated I would receive no more than a modest annual stipend, at my father's discretion, in the event of separation, and I felt something inside me go very, very still. William is a prudent man, my father said. He is protecting his family's interests. This is what men of his caliber do. Does he love me? I asked. My father looked at me as though I had asked something childish. Love is what comes after the contract is signed. The rest is just logistics. That night, I went to my mother's room. She was sitting at her vanity, removing her makeup with a methodical precision, and she applied to everything, and I sat on the edge of her bed and watched her reflection in the mirror. Did you love Dad when you married him? She paused. The cotton pad hovered near her cheek. In the mirror, her eyes met mine. That's not the right question, Ellie. What's the right question? The right question is whether I chose him. Whether, on the day I stood beside him and made my vows, I made them with open eyes. She resumed removing her makeup. I did. I saw who he was. I understood what he wanted. And I chose it. That's the difference between a smart marriage and a foolish one. Does he make you happy? My mother set down the cotton pad. She turned around, and for the first time in my life, I saw her without her armor, without the careful composure, without the practiced smile, without the subtle shield she wore like a second skin. She looked tired. She looked like a woman who had been holding something heavy for a very long time. Happy is a luxury for people who can afford it, she said. Your father is a good man, Eleanor. He is honorable and loyal, and he has never once been unfaithful. He provides for this family with a dedication that I sometimes think borders on the obsessive. What he is not is warm. He does not know how to be warm. But he knows how to build. And I chose to build my life inside what he built. That has to be enough. That night, lying in my bed in the room that had been mine since childhood, the canopy bed, the silk curtains, the view of the grounds that stretched to the tree line like a promise of something beyond, I thought about my mother's words. I thought about building my life inside what someone else had built. I thought about whether that was enough. Whether it had to be enough. Whether the things we settle for, the lives we accept because the alternative is too terrifying to contemplate, are actually sanctuaries or just another kind of cage. I called off the wedding 3 days later. My father did not speak to me for 2 weeks. Not a single word. He sat at dinner across from me, in the same chair he had always occupied, and he ate his food and read the Wall Street Journal and never once acknowledged my existence. It was the most brutal punishment he could have devised, and he knew it. My mother found me crying in the conservatory on the 3rd night of his silence. You've destroyed him, she said quietly. You know that, don't you? I know. He had already sent out the save-the-date cards. The Whitfields are furious. Edward has been receiving calls all week, people asking what happened, why the Carter girl broke it off. Your father will have to rebuild relationships that took him decades to establish. I know, Mom. And what will you do now? I looked at her. I don't know. But I can't marry a man I don't love. I can't build a life inside a prenuptial agreement that treats me like a liability. And I can't spend the next 40 years sitting across from my father at dinner, pretending I didn't make the biggest mistake of my life. My mother was quiet for a long moment. And then she did something she had never done before. She sat down next to me and put her arm around my shoulders, and she held me while I cried. Then we will figure it out, she said. Together. But we didn't figure it out. Not really. My father eventually broke his silence, but the words he used were measured and cold. You have made your choice. I will support you at a distance. But understand that your decision has consequences, and you will live with them. He meant it. He supported me at a distance for the rest of my life. The trust fund remained accessible. He could have frozen it, but he didn't. But the intimacy was gone. The warmth that had existed between us, however conditional, evaporated. We became polite strangers sharing a house, orbiting each other with careful civility, two people who loved each other and could no longer find a language to express it. Chapter 6: The Long Years. I was 23 years old when I left the Carter orbit and tried to build a life of my own. It was harder than I expected. I had a Yale art history degree that my father had essentially purchased, a trust fund that gave me financial independence but no actual skills, and a social circle that evaporated the moment I was no longer useful as a Carter connection. The women I had considered friends, the daughters of my father's associates, the girls from the Greenwich Junior League, melted away like morning frost, and I spent the first 6 months of my post-engagement life receiving invitations to parties I was no longer invited to and calls from people who wanted to know if the rumors about my breakdown were true. I moved to New York City, to a one-bedroom apartment in the West Village that cost more than Daniel's entire Stanford apartment but felt like a closet in comparison to Round Hill Road. I took a job at a non-profit children's art program in the Bronx, which paid almost nothing but which made me feel, for the first time since leaving the Children's Center in Greenwich, like I was doing something that mattered. I thought about Daniel constantly. I thought about him when I woke up in the morning and when I fell asleep at night. I thought about him when I saw a bridge on the news and wondered if he had designed it. I thought about him when I passed a parking garage and imagined him calculating load tolerances and stress points. I thought about him constantly, relentlessly, the way you think about a song you can't get out of your head, except the song was your whole heart. I Googled him once. Just once. I found his LinkedIn profile, still in Maine, still at the same firm, still doing historic bridge restoration. There was a photo of him standing in front of a bridge he had recently completed, and he looked older, thinner, more serious. And there was something in his expression that I recognized, the look of a man who had learned to carry something heavy without showing it. I also found out, through Sophie's occasional Christmas cards, that he had married a woman named Claire in the spring of that year. A librarian from Portland. Quiet, intellectual, the kind of woman who wore cardigans and sensible shoes and who would never, ever cause a scene at a charity gala. I imagined their life, modest and warm and uncomplicated, everything Greenwich was not, and I felt a grief so profound that it felt physical, like a fist closing around my lungs. At 25, I went back to school. Not medical school, my father had been wrong about that, at least. I went back for a degree in early childhood education, and when my father read about it in a letter I sent him, he had by then stopped taking my calls. He wrote back a single sentence: I am disappointed but not surprised. At 27, I became the youngest lead teacher at my program. At 29, I was promoted to curriculum director. At 31, I was hired by a prestigious private school in Manhattan as their director of early childhood programs, a title that came with a corner office, a 6-figure salary, and the quiet respect of colleagues who had no idea that I had once been Eleanor Carter of Round Hill Road. At 33, my mother was diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's. My father called me personally to tell me, the first time he had called me in nearly a year. His voice was steady, controlled, but I could hear the fractures beneath it. Your mother is ill, he said. I thought you should know. I went home. I sat with my mother in the conservatory where she had held me the night I called off my wedding, and I read to her from her favorite books, novels she had loved since girlhood, books with happy endings and romantic heroes and the kind of love that conquered all obstacles. And sometimes, in the middle of a paragraph, she would look at me and say, "Who is that young man you're always reading about, Eleanor? The one with the bridge?" I knew she was talking about Daniel. I knew because in her fading mind, She had preserved the only story that had ever truly moved her, the story of the man who built bridges and loved her daughter and proposed in a coat room. It was the most romantic thing that had ever happened in her life, and she held on to it even as everything else slipped away. My father, watching from the doorway, said nothing. But one afternoon, when my mother had fallen asleep and I was standing in the garden looking at the roses, he came outside and stood beside me. We looked at the roses together for a long time. And then he said, very quietly, "I was wrong." I turned to look at him. In 20 years, I had never heard my father admit to being wrong about anything. "I was wrong about him," my father continued. "About what he could have given you. About who he was." He paused. "I should have let you try. I should have," he stopped. He didn't have the language for this. Harrison Carter had spent his entire life building walls, and he did not know how to take them down. "I should have trusted your judgment. You were always stronger than I gave you credit for." "Dad," I said, and my voice broke on the word. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he said. "I don't deserve it. I'm just telling you. You should know." We stood in the garden until the sun went down, and then we went inside, and I made dinner, something simple, pasta with olive oil and garlic, nothing like the elaborate courses our family chef used to produce, and we ate together, the three of us, in the kitchen instead of the formal dining room. My mother laughed at something my father said, and for a moment, just a moment, it felt like we were a normal family, sitting around a table, sharing a meal. It was the last normal moment we ever had. My mother died 2 years later, in the spring, with me holding one hand and my father holding the other. She went quietly, peacefully, in the house on Round Hill Road, surrounded by the roses she had spent decades cultivating. My father stood at her graveside and did not cry, but I saw his hands shaking, and I knew that something fundamental had shifted in him, that the fortress was crumbling, that the man who had controlled every detail of my existence was, in the end, just a man who had lost the woman he loved and could not say the words. Chapter 7: The Reunion. I was 39 years old the autumn I saw Daniel again. I was in Greenwich for my father's 70th birthday, a milestone event that the family had tried to ignore, in the way that wealthy families ignore the inevitable. The house on Round Hill Road had been prepared for a small gathering, the guest list trimmed to family and close friends, the atmosphere carefully calibrated to avoid any mention of mortality or the passage of time. The party was at a private club on the water, the same club where my parents had been members for 40 years, where I had learned to play tennis and attended cotillions and been presented to society as a Carter daughter. The grounds were beautiful in October, the trees along the Long Island Sound turning colors that looked almost artificial in their vividness, gold and crimson and burnt orange, like a painting by someone who had been told what autumn was supposed to look like but had never actually experienced it. I arrived late, deliberately. I had spent the last decade building a life that was entirely my own, my apartment in the city, my career, my circle of friends who knew nothing about Connecticut old money or private equity legends. I was happy in the quiet, sustainable way that comes from building your own life from your own materials. I was not Eleanor Carter of Round Hill Road. I was Ellie, the woman who had once loved a bridge builder and lost him, and who had spent the years since trying to understand whether the loss had been worth it. I was standing by the window, looking out at the water, when I saw him. He was talking to a group near the bar, older now, more distinguished, with silver threading through his dark hair and lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. He was wearing a charcoal suit that fit him well, and he had the same posture, straight-backed, deliberate, the stance of a man who had learned to carry weight carefully. I knew who he was talking to before I reached them. Sophie had told me, in one of her Christmas cards, that Daniel's wife Claire had passed away 3 years earlier, breast cancer, aggressive and fast, leaving Daniel a widower with a 12-year-old daughter named Lily. I had read that card in my apartment in the city, and I had cried for an hour, not just for Claire, but for Daniel, who had already lost his mother and now had lost his wife, and who seemed fated to love deeply and lose deeply, over and over, like a man condemned to build bridges in flood zones. He looked up as I approached, and our eyes met across the room, and the world went very, very quiet. Ellie. Daniel. We stood there, in the middle of a crowded room full of people we both knew, people who would notice this interaction and calculate its implications, and we looked at each other. And in that look was everything, every Saturday at the Children's Center, every dinner at the Roasted Bean, every night in his apartment with the jazz playing and his arm around me. Every message I had deleted without listening to. Every night I had lain awake thinking about the road not taken. Every year of silence that had stretched between us like a chasm. You look. He stopped. He smiled, that same slow, warm smile that had undone me in the courtroom 15 years earlier. You look like yourself. Is that a compliment? It's the only one I have. I'm not the man I was at 29. I don't have smooth lines prepared. He shook his head. I'm glad you're here. We walked out to the terrace, away from the noise and the calculation and the watchful eyes of Greenwich society. The October evening was cool, and the water was dark and still, and the stars were beginning to come out over the sound. Claire, I said. I'm so sorry, Daniel. Thank you. He was quiet for a moment. She was a good woman. Steady. Kind. The opposite of you in every way. Is that a compliment? This time he laughed, a real laugh, surprised and genuine. You're still impossible. I learned from the best. We stood at the railing and looked at the water, and for a long time neither of us spoke. The silence between us was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had said everything important to each other 15 years ago and who were now, tentatively, trying to find a language for the years in between. Lily, I said. Sophie told me about her. She's 12. She's brilliant. She's also furious at the world for taking her mother, which means she's currently in her bedroom writing angry poetry and refusing to come to parties. He smiled, a father's proud, exasperated smile. She gets it from me. I bet she's incredible. She is. He turned to look at me. What about you, Ellie? What does your life look like these days? And I told him. I told him about the school, about the children, about the apartment in the West Village and the small group of friends who had become my family. I told him about my mother and the conservatory and the roses. I told him about the years of learning to be a person rather than a brand, about the slow and painful process of figuring out who Eleanor Carter actually was when you subtracted the name and the money and the expectations. What about you? I asked. The bridges? Still building them. His eyes lit up in a way I remembered, the way his eyes used to light up when he talked about strength calculations and load-bearing architecture. I have a project in Boston right now, a pedestrian bridge over the Charles. It's a suspension design. The cables are based on a principle I developed after we. He stopped. After, I agreed softly. I've spent a lot of years thinking about load-bearing structures, Daniel said. About what makes a bridge hold. And I've come to believe that the most important principle is redundancy. You don't build a bridge to carry one load perfectly. You build it to carry multiple loads, to flex and adapt, to hold even when the conditions change. Because conditions always change, Ellie. The only constant is the structure itself. The question is whether it's strong enough to flex without breaking. I understood what he was saying. I understood it in my bones. I should have chosen you, I said. That day in the study. I should have walked out the door and never looked back. Would you have been happy? I don't know. But I would have been free. Freedom isn't free, he said, and he smiled sadly. You know that better than anyone. We stood on the terrace until the party moved inside for the cake, and then we stood a little longer, because the world inside the club felt less real than the world on the terrace, with the water and the stars and the quiet between us. I should go, I said eventually. My father will notice I've disappeared. And you should. People will be looking for you. Let them look. But he stepped back, giving me space, giving me the choice I had never been given 15 years earlier. Will you be here tomorrow? Sophie's doing a small gathering at her house. Just family, low-key. I'd like you to come. Will you be there? If you are. I looked at him, this man I had loved and lost and spent 15 years trying to forget. This man who had built his life from nothing and lost the people he loved most and kept building anyway, who had learned to carry weight without showing it and to love without demanding guarantees. Yes, I said. I'll be there. Chapter 8, The Road Back. The next year was the strangest of my life. Sophie became, almost immediately, a bridge between Daniel and me, not a romantic bridge, not yet, but a bridge nonetheless. She invited me to things. She invited him to things. She engineered what she called casual encounters, with the ruthless efficiency of a woman who had spent her entire adult life organizing the schedules of small children and who now applied those skills to the matchmaking of two middle-aged people who were too stubborn and too wounded to figure it out for themselves. I met Lily on a Sunday afternoon in November. Daniel brought her to the children's center, the same center where he had first walked in looking confused and lost in a Yale sweatshirt, 15 years earlier. She was tall for her age, dark-haired like her father, with the same extraordinary coffee-colored eyes. She looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion, the way children look at strangers who might be trying to replace their mother. So you're the famous Ellie, she said. I'm not sure I'm famous. Dad talks about you all the time. He has this box in his closet, don't tell him I found it, with a ring and some letters and a photo of you two at some preschool thing. He thinks I don't know, but I'm 12. I know everything. Daniel, standing nearby and pretending to be absorbed in a child art project, made a sound that was somewhere between a groan and a laugh. Lily, he said, in the warning tone of a father who knows he is losing an argument, why don't you show Ellie the butterfly garden? Because there was a butterfly garden now. The center had expanded, built a small outdoor classroom with a garden that attracted monarchs and swallowtails, and Daniel had designed and built the pergola himself, in his spare time, for no pay. I stood under that pergola with Lily, watching the butterflies drift between the milkweed and the coneflowers, and I thought about the kind of man who would spend his weekends building pergolas for a children's center in memory of a love he had lost. Your dad loves you a lot, I said. I know. Lily shrugged, with the studied casualness of a 12-year-old who was actually deeply feeling everything. He's annoying about it. He makes me breakfast every morning, even though I could totally make my own. He checks with me before he makes plans. She paused. He tries really hard. And I know it's because he's scared of losing me too. Have you told him that? God, no. That would be weird. I laughed. And Lily looked at me with a quick, sharp smile, her father's smile, the one that reached the eyes, and said, okay. I guess you're not so terrible. For an old person. By February, Daniel and I were having dinner together every week. Just dinner. Nothing more. We talked about Lily and the center and the state of the world and the bridges he was building and the children I was teaching. We did not talk about the past, except in small, careful doses, a reference to a song that reminded us of his apartment, a mention of the ring he had designed, a quiet acknowledgement of the life we had almost had. You know, he said one evening over pasta at a small restaurant in Casca, the same Italian place where we had eaten 15 years earlier, though it had changed owners twice since then. I used to hate this town. When I first moved here, I thought Greenwich was the most pretentious, soul-crushing place I had ever been. But now, he looked around the restaurant, at the modest decor and the locals eating their Tuesday night dinners. Now I think it might be the only place in America where a bridge builder from New Hampshire can eat pasta with a woman from a family that once owned half of Connecticut, and no one bats an eye. Old money is very good at absorbing novelty, I said. Is that a Carter philosophy? It's an Illiner philosophy. I had to develop my own. Old money didn't teach me much worth knowing. And what does the Illinois philosophy say about a man who shows up 15 years late to a second chance? I set down my fork and looked at him. It says that the bridge builder should have contacted me directly instead of relying on Sophie to engineer accidental encounters. Fair point. He leaned forward. I've spent a lot of years being careful, Ellie. After Claire, after everything, I learned to keep my distance. To protect myself. To build structures that could withstand pressure without cracking. But I'm tired of being careful. I'm tired of calculating load-bearing capacity on my own life. And I'm asking you, again, for the second and, I hope, the final time, to marry me. He didn't have a ring. He told me later that he had decided, after the first time, that he would not buy another engagement ring unless he was certain it would stay on my finger. Instead, he reached across the table and took my hand and held it the way he used to hold it, gently, deliberately, with the careful attention of a man who understood that some things are fragile and that fragility is not weakness. I know your father is gone, Daniel said. I know you're free now in a way you weren't before. But I also know that you don't need anyone's permission to build the life you want. You proved that. You've spent 15 years proving it. So I'm not asking for your family's blessing or your forgiveness for what happened. I'm just asking for you. One more time. Because some structures, Ellie, are worth building twice. I thought about my father, in the garden, saying the words he had never been able to say. I was wrong. I thought about my mother, in the conservatory, holding me while I cried. I thought about the golden cage, and the coat room, and the ring I had taken off and placed in Daniel's palm 15 years earlier. I don't need a man to complete me, I said. I need a partner who understands that I am already complete. I know, Daniel said. That's what I love about you. Do you? I do. I love your strength, Eleanor. I loved it when you were 22 and terrified, and I love it now that you're 39 and unapologetic. You are the most remarkable woman I have ever known, and I have spent 15 years trying to convince myself that I could stop loving you, and I have failed completely. So here I am. Failing. Again. I laughed. And then I cried, which was becoming a habit when Daniel was involved. And then I said the only thing that mattered, the only thing that was true, the only thing that would set the rest of my life in motion. Yes. Chapter 9, The Ridge. We were married the following spring at the Greenwich Community Children's Center under the pergola Daniel had built. Lily was the flower girl. Sophie was the officiant. The garden was full of milkweed and butterflies, and the children from the center watched from the windows with the delighted confusion of young people witnessing something they didn't fully understand but sense was important. My father was not there. He had died the previous winter, quietly, in his sleep, in the house on Round Hill Road that I had inherited and sold to a young family from New York. I felt his absence at the wedding like a missing note in a chord. But I felt something else too, the presence of everyone who had brought me to this moment. My mother, who had held me in the conservatory. Sophie, who had spent 15 years believing in second chances. Lily, who had looked at me with suspicion and then acceptance. And Daniel. My Daniel. The man who had proposed twice, who had lost and grieved and built again. I wore a dress I chose myself, simple, ivory, nothing like the meringue I had almost worn to marry William Whitfield. When I walked down the aisle on Sophie's arm, I felt the weight of every choice that had led me here. Daniel was waiting under the pergola, in a gray suit. His hands were steady. His voice was clear when he said his vows. I promise to build with you. To build a life that can flex under pressure and hold under load. To build something that will last not because it is unbreakable, but because it is strong enough to bend. I put my hands in his. I looked into his coffee-colored eyes. And I said the words I had waited 15 years to say. I choose you. Not because I need to. Not because someone told me to. But because of all the bridges I have ever seen, you are the one I want to cross. Lily whispered loudly. That was so cheesy, you guys. Everyone laughed, including me, especially me. After the ceremony, Daniel and I stood alone under the pergola as the sun went down over the sound.
Was it worth it? He asked. The wait? It was worth it. Because it led us here. The first year of our marriage was a study in adjustment. We moved into a modest Victorian in Stamford with a wraparound porch and a garden Daniel had already begun planning. Lily moved in with us, and for the first few months, there was careful choreography around each other's habits and the thousand small negotiations that come with blending a family. Lily and I circled each other with wary respect.
She had her mother's taste in music. She played classical piano in the evenings, Debussy and Chopin drifting from the room we had converted into a music studio, and her father's stubborn streak. She did not make things easy, and I understood why. She had lost her mother. She had watched her father grieve for 3 years. And now there was a stranger in her house. So I gave her space. I gave her time. I made her breakfast and didn't comment when she barely touched it. I drove her to piano lessons and sat in the car reading. I waited. The breakthrough came in October, 6 months after the wedding. We were in the garden, and Lily was sitting on the porch steps when a monarch butterfly landed on her shoulder. She went absolutely still. You shouldn't move, I said, coming out with iced tea. They're delicate when resting. I know. Her voice was barely a whisper. Mom used to say butterflies are proof that things can change. Your mom was right. My mom told me, before she died, that Dad would find someone again. She said love isn't finite. That you can love more than one person, and it doesn't make what you had before any less real. I sat down next to her. The butterfly rested on her shoulder for a long moment, wings slowly opening and closing, before lifting off toward the milkweed. She sounds extraordinary, I said. She was. Lily looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something that wasn't weariness. Just openness. She told me you were the one who got away. The great Wadith of his life. She told you that? She knew everything about Dad. That was her gift. Lily stood and brushed off her shorts. But I'm starting to understand now. By the following spring, Lily called me Ellie. By summer, she asked me to help with her architectural sketches. She was passionate about drawing footbridges and elevation views, and Daniel encouraged her interest by teaching her the principles of structural design. She had her father's eye for form and her mother's sensitivity to proportion, and the sketches she produced were precise and creative at the same time. You should think about architecture, I told her one evening as she spread her latest project across the kitchen table, a detailed drawing of a pedestrian bridge over a small creek. I don't know. It's a lot of school. School isn't so bad. I went to Yale. Yeah, but you said that didn't really count. I laughed. Fair point. But you can build anything you want. You're smart and creative and you understand what it means to build something that matters. What's that supposed to mean? It means you've watched your father build bridges your whole life. You've seen what happens when a structure holds and what happens when it doesn't. That's not something you learn from textbooks. That's something you feel. Lily was quiet for a long moment. Then she hugged me, quick and awkward, the way 12-year-olds hug when they aren't yet comfortable with their own affection. Thanks, Ellie, she said. And then she went upstairs, leaving me with tears in my eyes and a feeling in my chest that I can only describe as fullness. Daniel found me at the window a few minutes later. She's something, isn't she? She's her father's daughter. Is that a compliment? It's the only one I have. We stood watching the garden as the light faded, as the butterflies retreated to their roosts and the shadows lengthened. I thought about the bridges Daniel had built, the literal ones and the metaphorical ones. The bridge to Portland, where he had retreated after I broke his heart. The bridge to Claire, who had been his partner for a decade and who had given him Lily and a home and the kind of steady love he deserved. The bridge back to me, which had taken 15 years to cross. "You're thinking too loud," Daniel said. "I can hear it from here. I'm thinking about load-bearing structures." "Ah, my favorite topic." He put his arm around me. "What about them? The strongest ones aren't the ones that never bend. They're the ones that flex and adapt. They're the ones that can handle unexpected weight without collapsing." Sounds like a metaphor. Maybe. Or maybe I'm just proud of the work you do. I turned to face him. "I love you, Daniel Ashford. I loved you at 22 when I was too afraid to choose you. I loved you at 39 when I finally found the courage. And I love you now, at 40, standing in our kitchen. The paint is from Lily's art project. I know. That's why I love you." He kissed me there in the kitchen, and I felt exactly where I belonged. The years that followed were not without difficulty. There were moments when Lily pushed back against boundaries and we had to find new ways to reach her. There were moments when Daniel's work took him to job sites for weeks and I felt the old loneliness creeping back. There were moments when the weight of everything we had survived, the lost years, the grief, the slow process of becoming a family, threatened to crush us. But we held. We flexed. We adapted. At 45, I became executive director of the Greenwich Community Children's Center, the same center where I had met Daniel, the same rooms that still smelled of finger paint and apple slices. I expanded the programs, hired new teachers, built a new playground with equipment designed by Daniel himself. At 47, Daniel completed the Harbor Bridge in Boston, the pedestrian suspension bridge he had told me about at my father's party. It was his masterpiece, and when it opened, I stood on it with him and Lily and felt the gentle sway under our feet. "Beautiful," I said. "It's a bridge," he said. "It's more than a bridge. It's a principle. It's proof that something can be strong and beautiful at the same time." He looked at me with those coffee-colored eyes. "That's what I always loved about you. You see what something could be, not just what it is. You see the stress points. And instead of running from them, you figure out how to make them stronger." Is that a metaphor? It's the only kind I know. We walked across the bridge together, the three of us, and the city spread out before us, Boston in autumn light, all red brick and green water. I thought about all the bridges I had crossed. The bridge from the Golden Cage to the world. The bridge from my father's expectations to my own choices. The bridge from a woman who could not choose to one who could. And the one I was standing on now, the bridge between who I had been and who I was becoming. I am 52 years old as I write this. My hair has more silver than it used to, and there are lines around my eyes. Daniel's hair is more silver than dark, and Lily is a junior in college, studying architecture at Cornell. She calls us every Sunday to talk about her designs and her life. We still live in the house in Stamford. We still have the garden with the butterflies. We still volunteer at the Children's Center on Saturday mornings, though we are older now and the children call us Mrs. Ellie and Mr. Daniel. Sometimes, on autumn evenings, Daniel and I walk down to the harbor and look at the boats bobbing in the water. We remember the boy we used to be, the choices we made, the long road that brought us here. You know what I think? Daniel says, "What do you think?" I think we got lucky. Lucky? Not lucky that it was hard. Lucky that it was worth it. Lucky that we found our way back. He takes my hand. Some things are worth the wait. Some structures are worth building twice. I lean into him, there by the water, and I feel the full weight of my life, the grief and the joy, the loss and the love, settle into my bones like a bridge settling into its foundation. Not collapsing. Not breaking. Just holding. Holding everything I am and everything I have been and everything I am still becoming. And for the first time in my life, I am not afraid of what comes next. Because I know, with the certainty of a woman who has learned to build her own structures, to carry her own weight, to flex without breaking, that whatever comes next, I can bear it. We can bear it. Together. The end. Epilogue, the view from here. It is spring as I finish writing this. The garden is coming back to life after another New England winter. The milkweed is sprouting, the butterfly bush is leafing out, and the pergola Daniel built 20 years ago is still standing, stronger than ever, the wood weathered to a beautiful silver gray that matches his hair. I think about the woman I was at 22, standing in a coat room with a ring in my palm, paralyzed by the weight of a legacy she had never chosen. I think about the woman I was at 39, standing on a terrace in Greenwich, watching the man I loved across a crowded room. I think about all the women I have been in between, the lonely one, the angry one, the one who spent years learning to be a person rather than a brand, the one who finally understood that freedom is not something you are given but something you build, one decision at a time. If I could speak to that girl in the coat room, that terrified, trapped, impossibly young girl who loved a man and couldn't choose him, I would tell her this. The road you are afraid to take is the right one. Not because it will be easy. Not because it will be painless. But because the woman you become on the other side will be worth every moment of the journey. She will be stronger than you can imagine. She will be happier than you dare hope. And she will look back at this moment of maximum pain and minimum clarity, and she will understand that it was not the end of her story. It was the beginning. Daniel is calling me from the garden. He has spotted a monarch butterfly, the first of the season, he says, which means the milkweed is ready and the cycle is beginning again. I set down my pen and walked to the window, and I watched him pointing at the air with the delighted excitement of a man who has never lost his sense of wonder, who has spent his entire life building things that are meant to last and loving people who are meant to stay. Come look, he calls up to me. She's beautiful. And she is. The butterfly rests on a coneflower, wings open to the sun, drinking in the warmth of a spring afternoon. She is small and fragile and utterly ordinary, just another monarch among millions, and she is also, in this moment, the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. Because she is proof. Proof that things can change. Proof that the cycle continues. Proof that even the most delicate creatures can survive the winter and return in the spring, transformed but not destroyed. I walk downstairs and out into the garden, and Daniel puts his arm around me, and we stand together watching the butterfly drink from the flowers we planted together, in the garden we built together, in the life we chose together after 15 years of wrong turns and detours and the slow, patient work of learning how to love without conditions. I was thinking, Daniel says. Dangerous habit. I was thinking about the bridge. The harbor bridge. What about it? I was thinking about how, when we first built it, I was so focused on the engineering, the load calculations, the stress points, the materials, all the technical stuff. He pauses. But now, when I walk across it, I don't think about any of that. I just think about the fact that thousands of people cross it every day. Thousands of people use something I built to get from one place to another. And some of them, maybe, are crossing that bridge because they need to get somewhere important. A job interview. A hospital. A home they've been trying to reach. That's beautiful. That's not the beautiful part. He turns to look at me. The beautiful part is that the bridge doesn't care why they cross it. It just holds. It was built to hold, and it holds, regardless of what the people crossing it are carrying. Whether they are carrying joy or grief or hope or fear, the bridge holds. It doesn't ask them to explain themselves. It doesn't judge their load. It just does what it was designed to do. Slacks, I say. Slacks and hold. At the same time, the butterfly lifts off from the coneflower and drifts toward the pergola, and we watch it go, two people standing in a garden on a spring afternoon, holding the weight of a life that has been hard and beautiful and worth every moment of the struggle. I think about the bridges I have crossed. The ones that were already there, waiting for me to find the courage. The ones I built myself, one decision at a time. The ones that others built for me, Daniel's bridges, Sophie's bridges, even my mother's bridges, built in the quiet spaces of my childhood when she told me that some things were worth the wait. I think about the bridge I am on now. The one that stretches from the life I had to the life I am still building. It sways a little under my feet, sometimes. It makes sounds in the wind that I don't always understand. But it holds. It has always held. And I think about the bridge that is still to come, the one that will carry me from who I am now to who I am becoming. I don't know what it will look like. I don't know what it will be made of. But I know that I will build it carefully, with my own hands, the way Daniel taught me. Flex and hold. At the same time, the butterfly disappears over the pergola, and the garden fills with the sound of birds and the smell of growing things, and Daniel's hand finds mine, and we stand there, two people who found their way back to each other after 15 years of wrong turns, two people who built a life together one honest day at a time. And for the first time in my life, I am not afraid of the bridges still to come, because I know how to build them now. I know how to hold. And I am not alone. Never again alone.